Hey there. Welcome to The Climate Cycle, a podcast focused on Canada's climate tech ecosystem. In each episode, we sit down with founders building climate solutions right here in Canada to better understand the challenges presented by climate change and what we can do about it. Today, we're diving into the world of commercial building retrofits with Christopher Naismith, the founder and CEO of Audette. Audette enables commercial real estate asset managers to deliver retrofits at scale, identifying opportunities in their portfolio and building out the capital plans to make them a reality. Buildings are a major source of carbon pollution, contributing about 40% of our global emissions. And because of their long lifespans, many of the buildings around us are still going to be here in 2050. While we largely have the technology to reduce this footprint, it's the scaling of retrofits across thousands of buildings that remains a massive challenge. Audette is tackling this problem by bringing data and software to what has traditionally been a very manual building-by-building process and turning it into a data-driven strategy that can work across thousands of buildings. In my conversation with Christopher, we talk about his path from civil engineer to startup founder, the changing dynamics in commercial real estate as climate regulations tighten, and how decarbonization can help asset managers actually create more value. He also shares his insights on building a climate tech company, why focusing on workflows and business models can be just as important as the technology itself, and his vision of a decarbonization plan for every building on the planet. Christopher, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I have a ton of questions for you. I'm very excited for this conversation, but I think maybe where I'd like to start is just a bit of background about yourself. We were talking the other day, you started your career as a civil engineer. Can you kind of share that story from civil engineering to now starting Audette?
Yeah, of course. So my first job out of engineering school was as a surveyor for a housing developer. And in my first couple of weeks on that job, I found myself in, a beautiful forest in the Pacific Northwest, tying ribbons around trees. And the next week I came back to find that forest clear cut to make way for the road that I had laid out. And next it was the lots. And now that plot of land is a community that supports hundreds of families. And it was really there, and thankfully early on in my career, that it was sort of so cemented for me that the responsibility that we have as builders, as engineers, as technologists, as designers, in making the right decisions. There's so much work that happens upstream of our interactions with either the built or the digital world that are really influenced by human decisions. And we don't really have a lot of control over that. It's, of course, super acute in the built environment, which contributes so much to our global emissions, that it made real for me the fact that I had to be making better decisions on behalf of my community. And that's really where the path towards Audette started.
Gotcha. That's a really interesting place to see kind of the first on the ground impact of decisions probably made in an office somewhere and seeing that direct connection. So talk me through from there, how do you end up at what is now starting a tech company?
Yeah. So from there, I took a decent amount of time to figure out, how might I help to be a part of the solution. I, built off-grid houses in New Mexico. I built water pipelines in Uganda. I just kind of tried my hand at a bunch of different ways of using engineering and applied science towards driving impact. And I ultimately found my way to a program in Montreal, actually, in Concordia, for building science. And what I really found compelling about that was a study of how do all of the disciplines intersect to drive performance in our building stock, and particularly our large commercial building stock. So a building is really kind of an ecosystem of not only the structure, but the mechanical systems, the electrical systems, all the automation. And depending on the way that's designed and operated, you can have a almost no impact building or an incredibly high impact building. And I really sort of fell in love with the art of figuring out how to make older, poorer performing buildings higher performing. And I just put that to use in a consulting practice for a good chunk of my career. I worked with a company out of Vancouver called SES Consulting, doing bespoke decarbonization studies and implementation. to help building owners to deploy clean tech into their buildings towards decarb. Audette is really just a continuation of that in that we're building tooling to scale that same sort of practice up to the order of hundreds or thousands of buildings. Happy to talk about how we're doing that.
Yeah, that's perfect segue. So it seems like one of the big advantages from, taking a technology approach is kind of scale and like looking for points of leverage. Could you talk about, what does Audette do and kind of the problem that it's solving?
Yeah, maybe I'll take those in the opposite order. So,
Yeah.
at a macro level, the problem is that buildings emit a lot of carbon. About 40% of our global emissions are attributable to the built environment. So there's really no carbon-free future without carbon-free real estate. About 70% of those buildings that exist today are going to exist into 2050 when we know we have to have dealt with them. And so there's no carbon-free real estate without retrofitting our buildings. The part that I don't think we talk about is that retrofits are already part of life. On average, about 5% of all of the components of our built environment are expiring and having to be replaced. So you can sort of think of it as like cellular renewal. Over the course of a couple of decades, we will have replaced almost every component of our buildings. And so we're going to do it anyways. It's just a matter of directing it in the right direction to be able to have the impact that we need it to have. So the specific problem that we're solving is we're working with large real estate asset managers. So logos you may be familiar with, like Prudential, Greystar, Starwood, those types of large asset owners, to help them identify all of the retrofit opportunities across their portfolio, attach business cases, and then get them into the broader ecosystem to secure capital and actually see them realized.
Gotcha. That's such an interesting point that like 70% of buildings, essentially 2050 exists now in a lot of these buildings. Like there's a good chunk of it that's kind of already here, and retrofits are a big part of obviously, making that a reality. Could you break down, so decarbonizing a portfolio is such an abstract concept. Could you talk about maybe like what does that look like tactically, but then where does Audette kind of fit into that?
Yeah, for sure. So to maybe make it less abstract, most of the emissions that come from our buildings are attributable to heating. And most of that heating is being done by combusting natural gas on site. So, if we were to deal with one thing, it would be that. It would be using cleaner fuel sources to drive heating. That would deal with a big chunk of our problem. And so decarbonizing the built environment is largely about making sure that you do the capital projects that will lower your carbon footprint incrementally over time and focus in on the major systems that need to be replaced. So the way that we are helping with that is to basically model every building in a large distributed real estate portfolio, identify those leverage points within the life cycle. So, when's your cooling system going to expire? When's your heating system going to expire? What are your lighting systems today? And what would happen if you were to systematically replace them with cleaner and cleaner technologies? And unsurprisingly, call that a decarbonization plan. So help the leaders in the organization to internalize, this is, we know this is where we want to go. This is what it's going to cost. This is what it's going to save. And basically every time they revisit their building, because this happens, quarter over quarter, year over year, you've got some parking lot replacement project, or you've got some tenant that's leaving. Like, you have to always be considering your capital strategy. We're basically just building the capital strategy that is also carbon aligned, that they can leverage to drive their strategies incrementally over time.
Cool. That is super interesting. So how does Audette actually gather that data? Because I would imagine the kind of the traditional way of doing it is someone walks into a building and kind of looks around and writes this stuff down and it gets into a database somewhere. But yeah, how are you kind of taking a software approach to this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So that was my job, to show up with a blank clipboard and, take photographs of equipment nameplates and kind of, build out an inventory of equipment. So we can't get around the fact that we need to do that to build a capital strategy, but there are other ways to start to get at it. So the first thing that we do, so we have a data warehouse that has every commercial property in the US and Canada in it, 6.9 million buildings. We've done the work to kind of pull as much data from external sources as we can. So we have footprint projects from Microsoft, we have some modeling projects from Google, we have other modeling projects from NREL, we have city scale records. There's all sorts of data that exists out there about buildings, point of sale documentation from brokerages who are sitting on top of these transactions. We're cleaning, triangulating, and just building our best working picture of the existing built environment. One of the gaps between that data and carbon performance is really what are all the systems inside of those buildings that are driving those emissions. To start to get at that, we do some aerial imagery analysis. We're looking for rooftop units, we're looking for condensing units, we're looking for cooling towers. All of these things are indicative of what the likely HVAC topology, let's call it, is for the building. And there's a bunch of just sort of rules-based infill we do. If we see a cooling tower, that's going to be rejecting heat from something. What it's going to be rejecting heat from inside the building is going to be a function of what the building's being used for and when it was built. And so buildings are complex, but they are just an intersection of design patterns. And so once we've encoded that, we can predict pretty well what the systems are that are driving those. And so we can show up day one into one of these engagements with a pre-built set of models for the building. And then we can invite folks to add their own operational data. So that's usually like utility data, equipment registries where they have them. A lot of this knowledge, while poorly structured, exists within these organizations. So by the time we're done onboarding their portfolio, we've built the same type of picture that a on-site energy auditor would have built, but we built it at scale in an incremental fashion. So we are able to achieve about 100 times speed and cost efficiency.
Wow, that's incredible. I just want to like nerd out on the software integration aspect of that, because I feel like one of the hard parts with any, like when you're integrating software into an existing business, particularly a large business, they have an existing way that they've been storing their data for a long time. It's maybe not in the format you need. And how much of that is like hands-on, okay, we're going to help, reformat your export, let's say, versus kind of like more plug and play?
Yeah, well, I think there's one really important thing that comes upstream of that, which is deciding what not to ingest. I think you get a lot of efficiency for figuring out what it is you care about before trying to integrate with things. And what it turns out when we're really focused on the large capital projects that are material to decarbonization, you can kind of leave a lot to the side and just focus in on what's your major equipment registry, when was it installed, how big is it? And a lot of that is done during property transactions for our customers. So these things called property condition assessment reports. The problem with that is most of that is in PDFs. Like it's not just sitting in some database where we can just integrate with it. But at the same moment in time, we've got AI tools that are fantastic at taking unstructured data and turning it into structured data. So there's a kind of a unique intersection that hasn't existed before and now exists to take that slightly messy data, normalize it, and make it valuable.
Yeah, interesting. And then, so in these engagements, it sounds like the kind of capital planning is running for, years, quarters, et cetera. What role does kind of Audette play? Kind of what are the length and duration of those engagements? And I guess, how are they using it?
Yeah, so it might be worth talking a little bit about our customers and their workflows. So we work with large real estate asset managers. So these are folks who have hundreds or thousands of assets organized into funds, managed as investment vehicles. And, in aggregate, the reason we've chosen to focus here is because they control about 10% of our commercial property value. And they are the ones for whom, if we can see them drive real, meaningful, differentiated businesses on top of decarbonization, the rest of the market will follow. But inherent in that is the way that they manage properties, is that they only hold it for a certain number of years, and they sort of incrementally just invest throughout the life cycle on a planned budget. And so what we're really aiming to do is have a live hosted decarbonization strategy for them to reference every time that they do have a budgeting discussion. And that happens sort of on a recurrent basis. And also the way that the landscape kind of changes around the buildings is really quite dynamic. So there's new fine structures, there's new incentives, there's different technologies available. So every time they go back to the plan, it might be slightly different in some way, and they can kind of move projects around in time. So it is really a live hosted business intelligence environment in which they can go and query the data to find the best opportunities in their portfolio. And as such, we've really shifted from this idea that like a plan is a one-time snapshot to something that it is really about investment intelligence that you need to have live and up to date all the time. So we have annualized contracts.
Yeah. And I guess I like that kind of that approach. And it sounds like kind of helping prioritize and figure out also like what are the highest leverage things to focus on first, rather than picking randomly off a list or like whatever you think is kind of going to be impactful.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard those called random acts of sustainability previously, and while they're useful for pushing forward, particularly pilot projects or marketing, they're not moving fast enough, and they're not really creating sustained competitive advantage for folks who are executing on these strategies. So we're really aiming to help leading asset managers to demonstrate that there is value in executing commingling decarbonization with more traditional investing, so that that differentiation is going to drive more interest and drive deeper retrofits.
Kind of pulling on that thread, and to talk about your customers a little bit more, I think the mental model that a lot of folks have in their head when we talk about retrofitting is kind of the single family home. And it's kind of like, what is the upfront capital cost? At what point do I break even on it and all of that? But I would imagine there's very different mental models for these commercial and portfolio scale retrofits. Can you talk about the difference there and kind of how that customer type thinks about these types of problems?
Yeah. It's super interesting in that they are put together in a fairly repeatable fashion. And these are investment vehicles. So what happens is you have an asset manager. They come up with some seed capital, and then they get a bunch of other investors to come join them on this deal, be it like, one building or hundreds of buildings. Those secondary investors are quite often like pension funds or endowment funds or, more institutional investors. So if you have a Canadian pension, you're invested in real estate.
Right.
And so you've got your seed, you've got your sort of group of investors, and then the rest of the capital is made up by lenders. So these are your banks. So they're pretty typical capital stack. And what happens as they deploy this money into real estate is the asset manager, the person who put the deal together, obviously take the highest risk, they get the highest reward, but they don't get paid until everybody else gets paid. So there's a baked in incentive for them to drive as much near-term revenue as possible to their investors so that they can get paid. And that is really probably the biggest barrier to decarbonization, because everything that takes away from that revenue incentive is counted as a net negative. And so if we think about how do we start to incentivize the behavior we want, it really has to be focused on, is this creating revenue for the building? Is it increasing rents in some way, or is it taking away from operational expenses? And so the value propositions have to be really, really financially focused, and that strips away a lot of the other considerations.
Yeah. And so if I understand that right, does that mean that the push is for like short-term revenue specifically, and that makes longer-term investments more challenging, or just the framing of those longer-term investments needs to be kind of different?
Yeah, it certainly biases towards short-term because it is the easiest to justify. You can think of operating income as being like the core driver of value. However, there is some shifting in the conversation around like what might be viable from a long-term perspective. It's being driven by, so there's, Canada, we have a carbon tax. That carbon tax is escalating. That is just a increasing cost center that is uniquely ascribed to carbon. And so you can start to think about, if I don't have to pay that tax, I make more money on this property. So there's a few sort of things that are driving that conversation in Canada. And in the States, there's the building performance standards, which are similar, but they're fines, and they are city by city, some in Canada, but mostly the US. Boston, for example, is $1,000 a day to a commercial owner who is over a certain threshold. these things are all coming into effect in the next few years. So if people are considering, okay, if I'm going to sell this building in 2035, that's part of my investment thesis, and it's going to have $300,000 worth of fines attached to it, is that going to erode the value that I had originally told my investors that I was going to give to them? And the answer is yes, it is. And so now they're considering more longer term investment decisions in the face of oncoming sort of value destruction.
Gotcha. Okay. And that's because at some point in the future, they plan to sell it as an asset, and they need buyers that are going to be excited about that property and not have a huge liability attached to it.
Yeah, exactly. And so one of the places we're uniquely positioned is just to help them understand that risk and hedge against it, because it's going to be a lot harder to do that investment after you've already replaced the boiler with another boiler versus when that boiler expires and all you need to justify is the incremental spend to do a heat pump instead. We're just giving them the future-facing business intelligence to make the right decisions in the face of all of that.
Gotcha. Okay. You mentioned like pension funds and kind of the relationship with these other investors. What are some of the pressures that commercial these real estate asset owners are feeling on the sustainability and carbon front? Because like my impression is that it's mostly, some pensions are taking a bit more of an activist role. There's various efforts to reduce carbon footprints, but just curious, from your perspective, like what pressure do they face on this front?
Yeah. So, with the caveat that the biggest one is on the income front and making sure that they don't get hit with undue taxes and fines and, wherever possible, drive down utility costs. What you're speaking to is sort of the investability vector, which is certainly growing. So, every Canadian pension fund asks these questions. The California Teachers Union, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, they all have their own framework through which they view investments because they've made pledges of their own. So they have to think about, given latitude to invest in this asset class versus this asset class, like where are we going to take on unnecessary exposure? And real estate is one of those places because of what I described with all of this sort of embedded fossil fuel infrastructure. There's a fair degree of risk in doing that if you yourself want to have, zero financed emissions by 2050 as a pledge. So what they're asking for is certifications. They're asking for scores, GRES, MSCI. There's a whole acronym soup of different standards bodies that are scoring these assets, and those scoring mechanisms are asking questions about not only today's carbon footprint, but increasingly, what is your plan to deal with that? And that's what a lot of investors are using as go no go on where they should put their money.
When you're talking to some of these organizations, how prepared are they for these conversations?
A lot of the folks we've been working with have been doing this for years, so they have well-established programs, they have leaders in place, so they're well prepared for today's conversation around investability. What is changing is that conversation is starting to look forward in time and say, okay, you may have this performance today, but what are you going to do next year and the year after and the year after? Because I think there's been enough of market around this and insufficient movement that people are aware that you can say you're going to do something and not ever do it. And that is, the window of tolerance for that is shortening. So now there's increasing pressure to actually decarbonize, and getting that the leaders that we work with are often very good at their jobs, and they have built the programming to report out on today's performance, but securing financing for deep decarbonization is still challenging for them because of the how hard it is to make these business cases. So there's a lot of perceived risk exposure and future investability, and also on the leasing side, attracting anchor tenants that they need to get out ahead of. And that's really what we're helping them with.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And so is that like one of the main kind of value props when you're talking to these organizations about Audette?
Yeah. I mean, the primary value prop is that they've been deploying, for the purposes of building this intelligence, they've been deploying energy audits. I have a lot of respect for energy auditing. I was an energy auditor for a long time, But the truth is that like a human first sort of boots on the ground approach is really hard to scale. It's like $20,000 an audit. It takes 3 months to turn around. And so when you're thinking about a portfolio of 1,000 buildings and you're doing 5, maybe 10 audits a year, you're never going to get there. You're never going to have ubiquitous intelligence on your entire portfolio. So by, driving orders of magnitude of cost and time efficiency into the process, we can give them that visibility that they never would have had before, and they can start to have meaningful conversations. The second order, and the one that I'm, most interested in, is securing budget against these projects. So, you can't do that if you don't know what it is you want to do. And if it doesn't stack up against all the other competing capital interests in a way that is attractive to the CFO, it's never going to happen anyways. So those are kind of the two big ones that we're supporting people with.
Gotcha. Okay. With that kind of boots on the ground, I would love to maybe hear your perspective on like in a typical, and I don't even know if there is a typical commercial building, but like, what are the main types of retrofits or kind of problems to be solved? You mentioned before, like heat pumps and switching out natural gas heating. But yeah, what are some of like the big ticket items that a typical building might want to tackle?
Yeah, so I would put them into buckets of things that are meaningful to decarbonization and then meaningful to utility costs. I think like we often count them as one of the same, but they're not always. So sometimes, depending on the jurisdiction, moving from like natural gas is a relatively cheap commodity, and sometimes electricity is a very expensive commodity. And so moving from natural gas as a fuel source to a heat pump, even if it is more efficient, is more expensive operationally. But that is the best thing to do for decarbonization. For decarb, it is generally electrify everything and clean up what you can on your side of the grid. That is, when we have clean energy, clean electricity, and we're using that exclusively for our buildings, we've effectively decarbonized. The second bucket is all the other things that are just good for business. So, light bulbs, insulation, anything that just drives efficiency into energy that you're purchasing are really important as well. And when they're bundled together, they can kind of offset the higher price tag of decarbonization.
I've noticed that you have an emphasis on decarbonization. I've seen some of your like writing and blog posts about the distinction between energy efficiency and decarbonization. Could you just expand on that distinction and kind of how you think about it?
Yeah, for sure. So not to go too deep in the weeds, but when we're doing an energy audit, there's actually like a classification of energy audits depending on depth, level 1, 2, 3. That original language was developed sometime like I tried to do like anthropologically sometime between 1998 and 2004. So
okay.
At best, it's 20 years old, this idea of what an energy audit is. And it was almost entirely focused on energy efficiency at that point, which is about, okay, you're procuring energy. How do you use it efficiently? How do you drive down costs? Which is a great question to ask. But as we've been shifting our global focus towards decarbonization, we haven't really adapted that methodology in a way that acknowledges that, let's say, energy efficiency is about getting a building from outside its ideal design conditions to inside them, or beating them in some way. Decarbonization is actually mostly about rethinking the design conditions entirely. So if this building is not all electric, how do we get it to be all electric? Now, that might not be the most cost-effective thing to do. The most cost-effective thing to do might be to just like turn all the thermostats down, and that's very cheap. But it's, if your baseline is carbon intensive, it doesn't really matter. Right? You should care about driving down costs. But if our goal is decarbonization, we have to think about this as sort of a redesign exercise. And that's really just something I advocate for us to at least intellectually think about, because I don't know that we've stopped and asked the question like, hey, should we be doing things differently now that our focus has shifted towards, to incorporate a different end goal?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do think the language around this matters, because even, your point about energy efficiency operating in specific bounds versus what if we shifted the window that we were talking about or should be talking about it just leads to completely different like ways of thinking and sets of actions that are possible, and opens new doors that maybe wouldn't have even been on the table before. I'd love to get your thoughts on the building code situation. This is a sentence I never thought I'd probably say and be so excited about. But so it seems like the commercial space is dominated by voluntary efforts like LEED and things like that, while updates to the actual building codes seem to be moving a fair bit slower. Maybe you could share kind of like your bird's eye view on the building code landscape and kind of how you're seeing that evolve around decarbonization.
Yeah. So it's a great question. And I think it's important to recognize that the building code is our minimum design standard. So, most keystone or, demonstration projects around decarbonization are far beyond that. So we can think about the building code as a useful way to drive the mass market. And the most impactful things that they can do are to mandate which fuel source are being used for certain end uses. Unfortunately, the standards bodies that are setting these are also the ones who are driving energy policy. And so there's a sort of a conflict of interest, honestly, or at least sufficient friction in these organizations to making things particularly aggressive. We've seen some examples of this. California is pretty good about it. But broadly, we haven't seen, it's not as ambitious as I think it needs to be to meet our science-based targets. Where it does drive interesting activity, as I mentioned, is in the fuel sources. So, in BC, there's some interesting examples, like as the efficiency of heating sources change, you just get constrained. They don't explicitly say that you have to do a heat pump, but if you're trying to hit over 100% or at least 100% efficiency or above, you can't do that with natural gas. And so you either have to switch to some other fuel source. It's actually sort of efficiency. It's couching the technology in just like efficiency number, which is a bit more. I've seen it be effective in some conversations. The other one is around refrigerants. I think building codes have a lot of latitude in mandating which refrigerants can be used, and I don't think we should downplay how much refrigerant leakage and the types of refrigerants we use are contributing to global warming. So I think that's one of the places that can be really, really effective.
Yeah, that's super interesting. That's not a topic that really gets a lot of headline attention, but I agree. It is like the global warming potential of refrigerants is dramatically higher than CO2 and even methane, but it's not really on the radar to the same degree. On the kind of policy and building code front, are there any areas or jurisdictions that you kind of look to as like a positive role model where they're doing something really interesting on the retrofit front or even building decarbonization?
Yeah, the one that I am looking to, and most of our customers are looking to, is the Building Performance Standards Coalition. So, are you familiar with Local Law 97 in New York? It's a local law that basically penalizes carbon emissions. So starting this year, I think it's $200 a ton over a certain threshold that building owners will be paying for carbon emissions. It's the first of its kind really in North America. And now it's being emulated. I think maybe Seattle was first. I can't quite remember, but it's been emulated across 10 different cities, including Boston, Denver, a number of others. And so what's unique about that is that when our utility costs go up, they usually get passed on to the tenant. There's a sort of what's called a split incentive. Building owners don't care that much about how much electricity costs, but when they have a fine that is attached to the property itself, they have to deal with it. And so it's the first time really that we're driving a conversation around a cost of carbon attributable to an individual asset. And it's driving some really meaningful conversations about retrofits. There's about 30 other cities that are trying to push these resolutions through city council, including Vancouver has just passed one. Toronto is considering passing one. I think these are going to be the biggest levers in North America for driving retrofits.
Very interesting. Yeah, because the split incentive right now is if you're the building owner, the tenant pays the utility bill. So you don't see that cost. You don't have an incentive to make that more efficient. But that structure you just talked about there kind of attaches that to the actual asset that you own, and you now have to start caring about it. Do I have that correct?
Exactly. And that gets carried through a transaction. So if you're trying to sell building A and building B, and one of them has $300,000 worth of fines attached to it, like which one is your buyer going to prefer?
Right.
Like, it's a pretty stark discount that's going to be applied.
Yeah. Okay. One other thing I wanted to get your thoughts on was this concept of brown discount properties. Folks are kind of looking at these properties that they can retrofit as an investment opportunity. Could you share a little bit about that approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe to sort of just make it as real as possible, think about you're selling your house and it turns out during inspection that you have a crack in your foundation. The buyer, depending on the market at the time, may still make you an offer, but they're likely to discount that offer based on the work that they know they have to do after they've acquired the asset. And it's sort of the same story is, if I take the example I brought up a couple of times around fines and taxes, like if I'm looking at two buildings side by side and one has more taxes attached to them, then I'm probably going to try to buy the one that doesn't. And if I am going to buy the one that does, I'm going to offer you less because I know I have to pay more in the operation of said asset. The slightly more nuanced version of that is thinking what I've heard called like the next owner problem. So there are different types of property investors. One called more value add, like a value add investor. And what they like to do is buy assets that are distressed. And that distress can exist in a bunch of different ways. Maybe it needs a big retrofit. Maybe it's the wrong property type for the neighborhood and they want to redevelop it. They're you can think of it as like flipping. They have a higher appetite and aptitude for taking on construction projects, and they get a higher reward for it. And then you have more core investors. And these are the folks who just like to buy stable assets that produce rent and hold them for a long period of time and make money off of them. The value add investors like to sell to those folks. They like to buy distressed assets, get them stable, and sell them to core. So that's a pretty common sort of investment strategy over, that whole period might be anywhere from like 3 to 5 years while they're stabilizing that asset and then they're selling it on. Now, the problem is going to come when the value add investor neglects to deal with decarbonization, meaning that the core investors are going to have to deal with it because of the way that our economies and our regulations are changing. So those properties will naturally lose value in the eyes of those acquirers because they don't like to do that. They don't like to do construction. They don't have the aptitude for it. They're not set up for it. They just want to buy stable assets and have it kick off the right amount of revenue. And so they're going to preferentially go after those assets that are stable, both from a rent perspective, but also from a decarbonization perspective. And as a result, there's just going to be a natural discount that's applied to those properties that are less saleable with that value proposition attached to it.
Okay. So it sounds like kind of the definition for stable is expanded a bit to also include decarbonization in that. And that's kind of a new criteria that folks are looking at as what they would bring into their portfolio.
Yeah, exactly. And I would add the other one that we don't explicitly deal with is de-risked from a physical risk perspective. So increasingly,
right,
with changing weather patterns, forest fires, things that are going to have to be sort of de-risked in order to get insured, for example. There's a couple of different emergent climate focused dimensions of stabilization and de-risking that have to be considered.
Yeah. So if we zoom out and look at the number of buildings that need to be retrofitted, it's a huge number. And as you mentioned, only a small number are kind of getting done every year. What would be your kind of wish list item to speed things up, 10x, or just accelerate that whole motion in our building stock?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is really the core of Audette's thesis is that I don't believe anything is going to materially happen until we have a market-driven incentive to do it. And I think that exists when we have differentiated pricing between high carbon and low carbon buildings. And once we have that, then there's going to be opportunistic developers, as I've described, flipping that gap to take lower valued assets and make them higher value and make more money as investments off of this. That's the way our system is set up. And I think we can really take advantage of that. What it requires is that we start asking the right questions. So when somebody is doing an acquisition, asking, do you have a decarbonization plan? Is it funded? What have you done in your hold period? And what is it that we have to do? When a large anchor tenant is entering into a lease, asking the question hey, what have you done so far? What is the plans for the future? How is this asset going to decarbonize throughout our lease period? I think we have to just introduce the concept that this is a valuable portion of real estate, such that we will then incrementally drive that gap in pricing. And that's complemented by this last piece, which I do see happening, which is a recognition we don't have to be zero carbon today. We have to have funded decarbonization plans that we can incrementally deal with over time. And we're seeing standards like LEED, GRESB, a few others acknowledge that a plan itself is a useful artifact to attach to properties, and rewarding that behavior for asset managers by giving them better ratings in market, making them more investable, leasable, et cetera.
That's really interesting. That makes a lot of sense, because I was talking to someone recently about, this idea that net zero seems super hard, but it's often because that last like 10, 20% is super hard right now. But everything before that maybe isn't that hard and can be done with like existing technologies, but it just takes time. So that's an interesting approach for like that, having that plan for that first 60, 80%, whatever it is now or can be kind of rewarded as, we know it's a pathway to get there.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that decarbonization is going to be incremental. Like it's almost unreasonable to expect somebody to take a building and like rip it to its studs and rebuild it green. What really needs to happen is every time we have an opportunity to inject some amount of capital into the building, we should be doing it in the right direction. And that's only possible if we have a working decades-long plan to do that. And over time, there will be some advancements in technology. Maybe we'll have fusion energy, but that's not going to be helpful unless every building is running off electricity anyways. So we have to be sort of future facing and incremental in our approach.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I would love to hear a bit about Audette today. Could you tell me a bit about what does growth look like today, markets that you're in, looking to target, and kind of like the long-term vision?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, there's a lot in there.
No, it's good. So our vision is a decarbonization plan for every building on the planet. Plain and simple, we believe that is something that should be attached to every building. We should understand, like, there's no world in which we decarbonize our economy without knowing how to do it. And so first and foremost, building a data-driven pathway for every asset. Right now, we are focused on doing that for large commercial real estate asset managers because of the value I've described. This last year has been really the proving year for that. So we've grown 300% revenue from the beginning of the year. We're working with 5 of the 10 largest asset managers in the world on building out their strategies. We're really focused in on learning as much as we can from these folks about how these deals get put together, where incentives lie, and helping them to establish this new category, which is decarbonization intelligence at scale. We're doing that in the US and Canada. So growth looks like a couple of things. One, figuring out how we move into adjacent markets, Europe, Asia. That's largely just a data exercise. And then the second one is, how do we move further down the implementation chain? So I'm not super satisfied just doing the planning. I really want to help people to put shovels in the ground. I don't want it to be a construction company. That's right. Not where we're going, but we're really aiming to build out a network of suppliers that can help to facilitate this transition, which is going to require a slightly different business model from a lot of different folks to think about how do we do this at commensurate scale. Like we have to be, there's about $15 trillion worth of technology that just has to make its way into the built environment in the next 25 years. So we have to think about how are we going to partner up with solution providers who can facilitate that type of scale, roll that many trucks, deploy that many heat pumps. And our job is to kind of build up the appetite for that market and then unlock all of the different, we can be the origination and data layer that helps to facilitate and track that activity and really build sort of a marketplace on top of that.
Cool. I love the ambition there. Like, and I mean that very sincerely. Like, I think looking at this is part one, but there's all these adjacent problems that we can be solving, and saying we can have a role to play in that and bring that value is just incredible to hear. So those are all the questions I had. Anything we didn't touch on that you think we should have?
That's a great question. I think we covered a ton. I did have a sort of maybe some reflections as a startup owner and a peer to a lot of other climate tech companies. What's occurred to me through my journey, where I started as like a bread and butter technologist trying to think about how do we design a better heat pump? How do we optimize a building automation system? I think there's a lot of folks focused on that. I think it's really important. I think the important thing that I've come to realize is that it's also as important to focus on the workflows and the business models. Like nothing I have described is revolutionary. It's just about trying to understand where do incentives exist for doing or not doing these projects, and how might we better align to those incentives to drive action. I think some of the most interesting technologies in the last decade have not necessarily been about redesigning the widget, but thinking about how the widget makes its way to market. And I think that's really the problem that we in climate tech have in front of us, is figuring out, we've done a great job of designing really interesting technologies that are, have a lot of impact. But if we can't figure out how to make them, ubiquitous and important to the businesses that have to deploy them, then it doesn't matter. So I love that we're in a privileged position to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that insight, because I think it's, particularly at this stage in kind of climate tech, it seems more important than ever. Like a lot of the widget building and all of that, it's kind of like, okay, we've got a lot of new widgets now. How do we get them to market? How do we figure out the incentive piece? How do we build what is the right business model to make this all work? Because that seems like where a lot of it just falls down without those pieces in place. Have you gotten some of those insights from working with the asset owners and those portfolio companies, like the incentives and understanding that?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm super grateful to all of our business partners and champions and how much they share with me and are willing to sort of collaborate. We have a whole webinar series ourselves talking to leaders in this space. There's a collective interest in making this work, even in the folks who are like the staunchest, dollars and cents folks. Like, I'm buoyed always by how much sort of enthusiasm and drive there is, and we're all it feels like we're all trying to solve the same problem together. It's just we built a system that incentivizes a certain type of behavior, and it's really hard to dismantle that. So we may as well figure out how we align the interests.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, so I want to just end with a couple of quick rapid fires for you. So we don't have to put too much thought into it, but maybe what's one thing you're most excited about going into the year?
I'm most excited about helping, this idea of a brown to green value add strategy is like a new term, almost a fairly new term. I'm excited about helping a few key folks to realize early wins on that, and then just do a bunch of publishing those wins and helping other people to learn.
Awesome. And what's a book, podcast, newsletter that you'd recommend folks check out?
Electrify is a really good one. It's about how do we electrify the US economy. That's a fantastic one.
Awesome. And then finally, any ask for the folks that are listening?
Yeah, I think if you've got a climate technology that is available at scale and can drive strong economics to commercial buildings, I want to chat with you next year. I'm building out a network of vendors and trying to understand their solutions and trying to recommend the best technologies into market. So hit me up. I'm on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, Christopher, thanks so much for sharing your time with us. This was incredibly insightful. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for doing the work that you do.
You bet. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave a rating and a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot and helps grow the show. To stay in the loop on Canadian climate tech news, recent fundraising, job postings, events, and more, subscribe to the Climate Tech Canada newsletter on our website. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.